So before we get started, let's actually look at a quick preview of what we're going to be building in this video in action. So I'm going to jump into my terminal and I'm just going to run my scraper function. So right now what's happening is my scraper is running through this entire website, and you can see we're iterating through the pages and we're extracting all of the job listings out of the website. So now my scraper's finished running, and if we look, I should have a jobs variable now. And if we run count on that, we should have 2,287 job listings stored in that variable. So if we look at jobs.first, we can see a cleanly sorted object that contains all of the information that I want to extract on each job listing from this job board. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to jump over into my terminal. We can see where we are here. So I'm just going to create a new directory for this project. So what we can do is do mkdir, and I'm going to call it scraper, and then we can just cd into our new scraper directory. So now we've created our scraper directory. The next thing I'm going to do is add a gem file. So I'm going to do touch and then gem file, and then I want to create the file that we're going to use to actually write our scraper code. So I'm going to create another file and just call it scraper.rb. So now if we do ls, we can look and see that we have a gem file and we have our scraper file. So at this point, I'm going to actually just open this up in Sublime. So now we have our scraper directory, and inside of that we've created our gem file and our scraper file. So for our scraper, we're going to be using a couple of gems. So the first thing I'm going to do is jump into the gem file we just created, and I'm going to add a couple of things here. So first I'm going to do source, and I'm going to do rubygems.org. And then we're going to add a couple of gems here. So there's really only two gems that we need for this. One is HTTParty and the other is Nokogiri. I'm also going to add the bybug gem just so that we have that, so that we can interact with the functions that we're going to be creating here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add gem HTTParty, and I'm going to add gem Nokogiri, and I'm going to add bybug as well. And that's pretty much all we need here. So the next thing we can do now is run bundle install to install our new gems. Perfect. So now that's set up and we've created our gemfile.lock. So the next thing that we can do is we can jump over into our scraper.rb file here, and we can start building out our scraper. Before we get started writing our scraper, I'm going to require in a few of the dependencies that we just added into our gem file. So we're going to add Nokogiri. We're going to require in HTTParty. And we are going to require in bybug. And now we can start building our scraper. So down here, I'm going to create a new method and call it scraper. And this is pretty much where all of our scraper functionality is going to live. Okay, so now inside of our scraper method, the first thing that I'm going to do is create a variable called URL, and I'm just going to pass in the value of the URL that we want to target. And then what we can do now is using HTTParty, we can actually make a GET request to that URL. So I'm going to create another variable and call it unparsedPage. And what we can do now is do HTTParty.get and pass in that URL. So what that'll do is make a GET request to that URL, and what we'll get back is basically the raw HTML of that page. So what we can do next is we can bring in Nokogiri and we can actually parse that page. So let's create another variable called parsedPage, and I'm going to set that equal to Nokogiri :HTML, and we'll pass in that unparsedPage variable. Okay, so now just to recap, all we've done so far is say, here's the URL that we want to target. We've made a GET request to that URL and gotten the raw HTML back from it. And then using Nokogiri, we've parsed that HTML into a format that we can then start to extract data out of. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to throw a bybug in here. And what that'll do is just essentially set a debugger that lets us interact with some of these variables. So once we've added that, we can jump into our terminal, and we can see we have we're inside of our scraper directory. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do ruby scraper.rb, and I'm just going to add scraper down here to actually run our function. So what will happen is our function will run when we enter this, and then these values will get set and we'll hit our bybug, which will actually let us interact with our variables. So over here, I'm going to run this. So we've hit our bybug, and now we can see that we're inside of our scraper method, and all three of those variables values should be set now. So for example, we can see that URL equals the URL we're targeting. If we look at unparsedPage, this is just going to be a bunch of raw HTML from that page. So we're looking at the HTML of this page right here. And if we look at parsed page, we can see that same content is now formatted with Nokogiri. And what we can do from here is use Nokogiri to interact with this data. So this is where things get pretty cool, because what we can do now with Nokogiri is we can target various items on the page based off of HTML elements and classes and IDs, and we can start to extract specific data from the page. So let's jump back over into the web page we're targeting for a second, and I'm going to open up the inspector, and let's take a look here. So basically on each page of this site there are 50 jobs listed. So what we can do is we can grab this and we can look at what the classes are of each of these blocks. So if we jump over here, we can see a class called listing card that is being assigned to each of these blocks, right? So each one of these on the outer wrapper of the block of data that we're trying to get at has a listing card class. So now what we can do using Nokogiri is basically target all of the jobs on this page by targeting that card listing class. So remember that our variable we created for this is called parsed page. And using Nokogiri now, we can use .css, and what we can do is target the div and then that class of listing card, and we can try that. And what we're basically getting back here is a list of all of these blocks of HTML and CSS. So let's actually assign that to a variable. I'm just going to call this job cards, and let's say that equals parsepage.css, and inside that we're going to target div listing card. So we get that back, and now if we look at that, if we do count on job cards, we should have 50. Yep, so what we have now is a list of all of these blocks. So what that means is if we take a look at jobcards.first, for example, we are basically looking at this listing for the Chief Financial Officer job offered by CoinMe in Seattle, Washington. So now how do we extract that data out of this listing? So let's just look at a quick example here. I'm going to create another variable and just call it first job and set it equal to job cards. For some reason I camel case that, and pull the first item out of that list. So now we have first job, and this is equivalent to the Chief Financial Officer position that we're trying to target right here. And you can see we're still using that Nokogiri format. In order to pull the data out of this that we want, which is the job title, the company, the location, and the URL to apply, we can dig a little bit deeper into this using that .css, and we can target some of these based off their HTML element and the class or ID for that. So if we jump back into the page and inspect this a little bit further, for example, we can see that this is wrapped with a span that has a class of job title. So if we jump back into our terminal, in our .css, we can do span.jobTitle, and we can see that we're getting back the HTML and CSS for that specific item. So if we want to grab the actual text out of that, what we can do with Nokogiri is just call .text. And just like that, we've plucked out the title from that listing. So using that same logic, if we jump back over here, we can look at the company, and we can see that that's wrapped with a span with a class of company. We can see location is a span with a class of location. And if we jump over here, we can see that we have an anchor tag with a button or button standard class on it. So we can use all of those to then target each of those items. So for example, we can change this to company, and we can grab the name of the company. We can change that to location, and we can grab the location, and we can also, let's say we want to grab the URL. This is where it gets a little bit different, but it's actually not that hard. So let's say we want to target the anchor tag inside that block. So the formatting for anchor tags is a little bit different, but if we look at this, we can see that this is actually an array, and this entire block is the first item in the array. So what we can do is just hit the first item of the array, and if we look at this, we can see that there is something called attributes here. So let's just add on .attributes. And then if we want to go a little bit deeper into that, what we can do is we can try doing, let's say, href, and then we can add on value. And what we can see is that we're getting the final URL for that listing now. The actual URL would be something like this, and this would get tacked on like that, but you can add a little code that would piece that together yourself. So now let's take some of what we just did in our terminal and add that into our scraper function. So I'm going to go back into Sublime here. So what we want to do first, if you remember from our terminal right there, is we want to create a variable that represents, let's say, all 50 job listings on a page, and we want to pass in the data for all of those job listings into basically an array. So let's say parsepage.css, and again, we're just going to target that div.listing card class. And what that'll do is basically give us the data for 50 jobs. And from there, what we can do then is iterate over our job listings using .each. So we'll do job listings.each, do job listing singular, and we'll set up an iterator like that. So now inside of this iterator, all that we have to do for each job listing is basically what we just did in our terminal. So I'm going to create a new variable called job, because it'll be each individual job. And what we can do is just jump back over to our terminal, and we can actually just grab some of these that we just did. So we'll want to grab the job title. So we're going to grab that, and we'll do title, and we'll set that to job listing.css. Hit the job title and get the text from that. Similarly, we want to do the same thing for company. We want to do the same thing for location, and we want to do the same thing for the URL of the job listing. So let's just go back over here, and we'll do the same thing for company. We'll do the same thing for location. And then finally, we will also grab what we just did to get the final URL. And in terms of getting the full URL, we can do a couple different things. So for example, we could just do this and sort of just prepend on something like this if we wanted. And add those two together to basically create the full URL. You can do whatever you want for that, but that's basically all there is to that. So if everything is working properly so far, what we should have now is a way to iterate over 50 jobs in a page, and we should be able to extract the data that we're trying to target out of each of those jobs. So let's move our bybug up into our iterator so we can actually see what's happening for each individual job, and let's rerun this again. So I'm gonna continue through the bybug there. So now we're back in our directory, and what I'm going to do is just run our scraper method again. So I'm going to do ruby scraper.rb and let that run. And what should happen is we should hit our bybug. We hit our bybug, and now we should be inside of our job listings iterator, which is iterating over our 50 listings, and we should be in our first job listing. So we put this after jobs. So if everything worked as we are hoping, then what we should have now is a job object with all of the data that we're trying to extract. So looks like we have our title. Let's see if we have our company. We have our company. We have our location, and we have our URL. So now if we continue, we'll go to the second job listing on the page, and again, if we look, we should have a job title, a job company, a job location, and a URL. Okay, so it looks like everything is working perfectly so far. I'm going to exit this just so we don't go through all 50. So you can see we're back in our scraper directory. So over here in the code, let's create an array that we can use to store all 50 listings from what we're doing with that iterator. So I'm going to create a jobs variable and just create array.new to just make a new empty array. And basically inside of our job listings iterator, let's just scoop every new job into that jobs array. And then down here we can put our bybug outside of the iterator. So basically what we just did is we created an array, and now as we iterate through those 50 listings from the page, we're going to pass in each one of these jobs into our array. So what we should end up with by the time that we hit our bybug is 50 items in our array, and each one will be a job with data on the job title, company, location, and the URL to apply. So let's jump back over here and let's just run our scraper.rb. So it's going to iterate through all 50 and then it hits our buy bug. And now what we should have is a jobs variable with all 50 listings in it. So we do count, we can see we have 50 items. We can look at jobs.first. We have this nice clean sorted set of data for each job listing now, right? So now just like that, we've built a super simple web scraping tool with Ruby, and we have scraped this web page and we've pulled all of the data from the job listings on this page. So that's pretty cool, but what if we want to scrape all 2,287 jobs from this entire website and not just this page? Our web scraper has to be a little bit more intelligent. So now let's make a few tweaks to our web scraper. We'll take pagination into account and we'll scrape all 2,000 or so listings on the site instead of just the 50 per page. So there's a couple of things we'll want to know in order to make this work. The first is basically just how many listings are getting served on each page here. So we already know that it's 50 listings per page. The other thing that we want to figure out is the total number of listings on the site. We already know that. We have 2,287 listings. The last thing we want to figure out is just what the page structuring looks like for the pagination. So I'm going to click this and we can see that the URL changes a little bit and we get a query parameter of page that gets set to the page number. So now using that information, let's make a few tweaks to our web scraper function. So after we assign the job listings, I'm just going to jump in right here and we're going to add a few new variables to our scraper. So the first thing that we're going to want to have is we want to have a per page. And basically that's going to be how many job listings are there per page. And we know that it's 50, but we want to sort of future-proof this. So theoretically, if the number of listings on the website changed, we'd want to make sure that our scraper didn't have this value hard-coded into it of 50. So what we can actually do, since we've already assigned job listings up here and plucked all of the listing cards, is we can just do job listings.count. And that should basically still give us 50 listings. But what we're doing is making sure that if that number changes to 10 or 20 or 100 in the future, when our function runs, it'll be set to the appropriate number. And then I'm also going to create a variable of total, and I'm going to set that equal to the total number of job listings on the site. And if we look back here, we can see that it's 2,287 listings. But again, we want to future-proof this, right? So if another listing got added to the site, then our total would be inaccurate. So what we actually want to do is, since we've already at this point created our parse page variable, we can try to grab the number from the page based off the initial request, and we can try to keep it conditional so that if that number changes in the future, when this method runs, it'll always have the correct total, similarly to always having the correct per page. So this is probably going to be a little bit hacky, but let's see if we can use our parse page variable and still get to that final number of the total job listings on the site. So we know we're going to do parse page, and then we're going to try to grab something, probably using .css. So let's jump back over here. So how do we grab this number? So if we look, we can see this is a div with a class of job count. So we can start by doing css div.jobCount. And let's actually jump into our terminal and see what that gives us. So we can see we have a Nokogiri object there. So let's try to do that again and go another level deeper by using text. So now we've grabbed the string that we're trying to target, but what we want to do is extract that number out of it. So maybe just as a quick thing, and again, this is going to be kind of hacky. There's maybe better ways to do this, but let's see. Maybe we'll call split on that, split it at the spaces, and then we can grab it from its index in the array, and then we can just really quickly g sub off that comma, and then finally we can convert it to an integer. And that is probably not the greatest way, but that's a way that we can grab that number out of it. And as long as that string doesn't change, that would keep grabbing the correct value for us as the number of jobs added to the site changes. So let's go ahead and let's just grab that. And let's just throw that in there for the total. And that should pretty much give us that number of 2,287 while keeping it a little bit more flexible to jobs getting added to the site and that number changing. So now we have our per page value and we have our total. I also want to create a page variable and just set where we're going to start. So we can set that to 1, because if you look back in here, you can see that we have a new URL structure of listings and the page number. So we can start this at 1. So now what we have is our starting point, which is going to be page 1. We have our per page variable, which is going to be 50 listings per page. And we have the total number of listings on the site, which is going to be 2,287. So now the next thing we want to do is basically tell our scraper what the last page is going to be. Because what we're going to do is we're going to increment on our page number, and we're going to iterate through all the pages of this job board and scrape each set of 50 listings on each page. So we want to set an endpoint so that it's not running infinitely. So what we can do is create a variable of last page, and we know that we have 46 pages, so we could set this to 46. But again, we want to keep this a little bit more dynamic so that as more jobs get added to the site, and that number goes up to 47, 48, and so on, our scraper is going to be able to detect that based off the data that gets passed in when we run it. So let's see if we can use the above values to get to that same answer of 46. So what we could do is, for this variable, we can make it our total, and I'm just going to make sure that it is a float. We're going to divide our total by our per page value, and I'm also going to make that a float, and then we're just going to round that number. And actually, let's just jump into our terminal and try some of this just to see that this is on the right path. So we know that our total should equal 2,287. That works. We know that our per page should be 50. That works. And now we know that we want our last page value to equal 46 based off that data. It looks like that works too. So all of our numbers are correct. But on top of that, they're also set up so that as those values change over time, our numbers can adjust accordingly. So now that we have those values set up, we can adjust the way that we're looping through our job listings to account for pagination. So what I'm going to actually do now is I'm going to wrap this in a while loop, and what we're going to do is basically pull in our starting point, which is this page variable, and our endpoint, which is last page, and we're just going to say, well, page is less than or equal to last page. Do everything inside of this while loop. So now inside of our while loop, what we want to do is we want to add in what's going to be our pagination URL. So basically this is going to be this URL. And what we're going to actually do is, instead of hard coding in the page number, we're just going to pass in our page variable. So this will start at page 1. And then after each iteration in our while loop, we're going to increase our page number by 1. So now what's going to happen is we are going to start at page 1, and we are going to, again, on each of these pages, run HTTParty and Nokogiri. And I'm just going to adjust this a little bit to call this our pagination unparsed page and our pagination parse page. And what we'll just do is we'll adjust all of this a little bit. So basically the same thing that's happening above is going to happen here, but all this is going to be happening with the incrementing paginated page. So basically we're going to be doing the exact same thing we did here, where we pass in a URL, we make a GET request with the HTTParty, and then we use Nokogiri to parse that HTML and then allow us to scrape the data out of it. But we're going to be doing that to a number of different pages based off the pagination here. So you can kind of think of this up here as the initial recon mission, and then this is actually now where the meat and potatoes is going to happen. So we basically want to grab our 50 listings per page again, but we want to adjust this a little bit. So we're just going to, again, we're just going to adjust the names of the variables a little bit again. So we're calling this on our paginated parse page here, which is going to be changing with each loop. And let's just make sure that we're using that variable here. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but basically we're just repeating what we did initially in our single page version, but now we're accounting for pagination, and then we're going to be doing the same thing where we make a request to HTTParty for that URL, and then we use Nokogiri to parse the page and then scrape the data out that we want. So everything else can stay basically the same, and I think we're actually probably ready to try rerunning this. This is going to take a little bit longer because it's going to be iterating over about 50 pages instead of just that one request. So I'm going to actually put in a couple of puts into this just so that we can kind of see what's happening from our terminal as it's running. So let's spit out the pagination URL, and then let's just make a little prompt that says page, and then we'll make it pass in the current value of our page variable. and then let's add a little spacer here. And then down here, after we add the job, let's do another puts, and let's make that say added job, and we'll pass in the title, and then we'll add another little spacer here. Cool. So now if everything we changed works accordingly, what will happen now is this will run over about 50 pages, and we will collect data on about 2,287 job listings. So let's jump into our terminal and just see what happens when we try to run this. So I'm going to exit. We can see we're inside of our scraper directory, so I'm going to do ruby scraper.rb. So now what's going to happen when we run this ideally is this is going to iterate over all 46 pages. It'll grab 2,287 jobs, and as it's running, we'll be able to see what page number we're hitting, and we'll be able to see which jobs are getting added into our jobs array. And then when it's done iterating through everything, we should hit our by bug after the while loop, and we should be able to take a look at our array of data on 2,000 plus jobs. So let's run this and see what happens. Cool. So it's kind of jumping quickly, but you can see the page numbers increasing, and we're seeing all of the job titles as they're getting added into our array. So we're on page 19, 20, 21. So I'm just going to let that run until it hits all 46 pages. Cool. So now we have hit our by bug over here on line 36, which is an indicator that we have finished scraping the entire site. And what we should have now is a jobs variable, which is an array of our job listing objects. And it should be basically 2,000 plus objects with data on each job listing. So we can see we have this big massive array. If we count it, it should be 2,287, I think. Yep, so we have all of our jobs, and now basically we have data on every job listing from the site. So we can see, we have the title, company, location, and URL for each job listing. So basically just like that, we've built a simple but powerful little scraping tool. And we've seen how we can basically scrape this entire website and pull data on 2,287 jobs. So that's pretty much it. And as you can imagine, you can do a lot more once you start playing with this than just scraping job listings. So if you want to learn more, or if you want to grab any of the code from what we just did, I'm going to include a link below, so check that out. Otherwise, yeah, that's kind of all there is to it, and have fun.